You're listening to the Jefferson Exchange. Thanks for joining us. The JX starts today with the debrief, where JPR reporters discuss the stories they've been working on this week, including changes to recycling in Oregon, more money for senior housing, and preparations for earthquakes in Klamath County. I'm Maria Carter, JPR's news director.
I'm Jane Vaughn, housing, homelessness, and education reporter.
And I'm Roman Battaglia, science, environment, and politics reporter.
Roman, let's start with you and something that I think comes up as a question for me almost weekly, at least. Recycling. There's some changes to recycling in Oregon. Can you tell us what that means for people like me?
Yes, hopefully it should make things easier for you because you won't have to question things as much because Oregon is moving to this statewide unified list for recyclables. So instead of things being different, basically different trash companies in different localities kind of set what could be recycled and what could not. And so now, starting on July 1st, they're kind of moving to this and they've approved it is, everyone across Oregon will be able to recycle the exact same things. And depending on what was previously accepted, this could change things a little or it could change it a lot. So I talked to Rogue Disposal in Medford, and previously they only accepted a very limited recycling list. It was just corrugated cardboard, mixed paper, tin aluminum cans, and then number 1 and number 2 plastic bottles and jugs, and that was it. But now that list is expanding a lot to include things like gift wrapping, scrap metal, including pots and pans, a lot of more types of plastic, including buckets and nursery pots, and also those like plasticized paper milk cartons and those like shelf-stable cartons are also going to be recyclable under this statewide list. And so, the recycling companies are still expanding their capabilities to process this stuff. July 1st was kind of the start date to start this expansion of collecting this stuff. So they might not have all the capabilities yet. You might not get a notification from your company that they're moving to this list yet, but at least Rogue Disposal, who I talked to, said that they would at least take the stuff and figure out how to get it processed while they kind of get everything up and running.
And besides my turmoil and troubles, what's behind these changes to how we recycle in Oregon?
Yeah, so this was because of a state law that was passed in 2021, which was designed to modernize the state's recycling system. And a lot of that happened because of, I believe it was back in 2017, there was this there was a special name for it that I forgot, but China takes a lot of our recyclable materials, or they had in the past, and they would process them and use them to make new things. But China decided, like, we're not going to take your recyclables anymore. They're too dirty. They're too contaminated. There's too much different stuff in here that we have to process and get rid of, and it's too expensive. So they decided not to take anything from America at all, which really threw a wrench on a lot of recyclable stuff. It made it a lot harder to recycle
because we didn't
things.
have the capacity here.
Yeah, I mean we don't recycle that stuff or produce things, and a lot of stuff is produced overseas. So that's where the recyclable materials need to be sent to. So a group of companies and state people got together to kind of fix that, at least in Oregon. Basically, the goal is to make Oregon's recyclables more attractive for other countries and these processors to take. And then part of that also is just making recycling easier and simpler for all Oregonians because, like I said, it can be confusing from city to city. If I go up to my friends in Medford, their recycling bin doesn't take the stuff that they take in my recycling bin at my house. So, this list makes it easier for everyone because recycling is the same, and then they can also invest more in marketing and outreach to make sure people know what to recycle and how to recycle it and making sure that it's clean and dry and things like that.
And so more behind the scenes, there are also some bigger system-wide changes as part of the state law. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, and part of this is like enabling these recycling companies to accept this whole statewide list and making things easier for everyone. So a bigger part of this law is basically making everyone pay their fair share into the recycling system. So producers of these recyclable materials will have to pay into the system, and they had to start paying starting on July 1st. So companies like Coca-Cola or IKEA or someone who creates cardboard boxes, if they create any materials that are recyclable under this list, they now have to pay into this system. And then they also have to, this organization that they pay into, like, offers and makes ways to make things recyclable, and they also pay for upgrades to recycling companies and upgrades to the system itself. So they are able to do a lot more investing in marketing and facilities. And it's also going to make things cheaper for trash pickup companies because it sounds like hopefully they won't have to pay these tip fees. Right now they have to pay to dump their recyclables at these facilities, so they hopefully won't have to pay that. And hoping that means that your bill won't go up because of this law, because these producers are now paying into it. And so that money that the companies are going to pay into is going to start being available this month because now they're starting to pay into this. So a lot of stuff is kind of happening behind the scenes to make this whole recycling system easier and cheaper and better for everyone so that, our recycling is more attractive for everyone.
So easier, better recycling with more people, including companies, paying.
Yeah, it's making everyone pay into the system rather than just, us, people
As
who
the
get their
consumer.
trash picked up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Roman. Jane, you wrote a story this week about 2 bills in Oregon that are trying to create more housing for certain vulnerable populations. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So the first bill it's a House Bill 3506, and it allocates $3 million with the goal of helping keep seniors and people with disabilities in their homes, what people think of maybe as aging in place sort of thing. So that might be installing a ramp or grab bars for stability, these sort of accessibility modifications so that people can stay in their homes. And then the second bill is House Bill 3589, and that sets aside $24 million to really incentivize housing development specifically for seniors and for people with disabilities. And so these 2 bills are really focused on those 2 groups and getting more affordable, accessible housing. And the funding for both of these bills comes from Oregon's Property Tax Deferral for Disabled and Senior Homeowners Program, which is quite a mouthful.
Yeah, I was going to say that 3 times really
Right.
fast. Yeah.
But it basically lets homeowners, if you're a senior, if you're disabled, you can borrow from the state to pay the county property taxes. And then when your home is eventually sold, the state is repaid with 6% interest. And so apparently that fund currently has about a $70 million reserve, which is plenty, well above what they need to run the program. And so the idea is to take this money, I guess it's a total of about $27 million for the 2 bills, to pay into this idea to help people stay in their home and to help incentivize housing development specifically for these 2 groups.
Yeah. Well, tell us why. Give us some background here that this is needed right now.
Right. So the general idea is that rents are increasing, Social Security is not keeping pace. A lot of older adults are being priced out of their homes. Social Security in the past used to help more with this, but it hasn't really kept up, and inflation and all these things that we talk about. So it's now much more of a problem. People over 50 are the group that is most likely to spend more than half of their income on rent. So definitely rent burdened, as the saying goes. And also this has shifted into homelessness as well. In recent years, the population of homeless people has also aged. So about a fifth of homeless people right now are 55 or older. So that's an increasing problem as well. And I did a whole story about this a couple months ago, but people over the age of 50 are often becoming homeless for the first time in their later years. So they may have worked their whole lives. Maybe it was sort of a lower wage job, or they didn't have a lot of savings. And then something happened after the age of 50. Maybe their spouse died, or they got sick, or got divorced, whatever happened, and then people are suddenly finding themselves either homeless or really financially struggling on the verge of homelessness. And so the bottom line is the need for more affordable and accessible housing, particularly for older people who might need, like we said, specific accessibility modifications, grab bars, things like that. And in general, there just isn't enough housing for older people. There are certain programs that try to address this, but people can wait years to try to get a spot. And it's a particular problem also in Oregon because we have, in general, a lack of housing. We've been underbuilding for years the number of units that we really need. And so I talked to State Representative Pam Marsh about this. She sponsored both of these bills. And we know that Oregon is behind in building enough housing in general, but she says there's a particular need for this type of housing for these populations.
Yeah, a lot of our affordable housing over the last few years has really emphasized family housing for good reason. So we've rewarded developers who are doing 3 or 4 bedroom units because we want to be able to accommodate people with kiddos for good reason. But at the same time, now we know that seniors are showing up in these tremendous numbers in our shelter system. And we've underbuilt the studios and 1 bedrooms that are appropriate for those individuals.
Right. So different populations have different needs. If you're older, if you're disabled, a third floor walk up might not work for you. And sometimes having these modifications really makes a big difference. Like I said, I did a story a few months ago talking to a 82-year-old man in Medford who had fallen and broken his hip on the front steps of his home he was renting. The steps were unstable. And so there was a program called Hearts for Seniors that built him a new ramp, and then he can safely stay in his home, continue to live there. He doesn't become homeless. He doesn't need to try to find someplace else to live. And so that's the sort of thing that this bill 3506 wants to do, so that older people don't become homeless or need to move or find different housing.
So these sound really great, but have they been signed into law yet?
They have not. They have passed both the House and the Senate in Oregon. Very little opposition. They seem to be pretty broadly supported. They're expected to be signed into law by Governor Tina Kotek. They're waiting for her signature right now. And I know that House Bill 3589 in particular got a lot of support from local groups. There was a whole list of nonprofits and organizations that support that work. So Jackson County Housing Authority, Access, Rogue Action Center, AARP Oregon, all these groups have really thrown their support behind this bill. So it is expected that Governor Kotek will sign them both.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jane. And Roman, you also reported on a proposed emergency operations center in Klamath Falls. Who is proposing this and why?
Yeah, this was proposed by the emergency manager at Klamath County. He wants it Ian Thigpen. He has this, I guess it's the giant proposal to kind of do some renovations on some existing county buildings. One of them is currently the temporary offices for the county juvenile department, and he wants to turn that building into this giant emergency operations center, which imagine sort of like a big office conference space. There's like a big space in the middle where people can kind of gather and set up tables and like do planning for wildfires or emergencies, and then there's a bunch of office and extra rooms around the side for different things. So it's kind of everything you need to organize and coordinate an emergency response for things like wildfires or other, emergencies. The other building that he's proposing isn't currently occupied, and he wants to turn that into a bunkhouse for emergency teams to sleep in. It wouldn't be able to house everyone. I think some of the rooms it'd be like 30-ish people, but be able to house kind of leadership, people who are getting flown in to do these emergency management stuff. And he wants this because Klamath County currently doesn't have an emergency operations center, or at least a permanent one. They've had to activate an emergency operations center a few times in the last year, but they've had to do it in different places each time, and it just makes it confusing and harder to plan, and they have to pay rent on those places, and things like it's important to have these operations center for these people because like they need printers, and he was talking about how they need to drive this portable printing trailer from Washington just to be able to print the papers that they need to do all this planning.
Yeah, and I'm sure other people might just have their station. So, the fire chief's going to be here and so is going to be there.
Yeah, it'll be easier
yeah.
to plan it out and have one designated space that they know they can go to.
What kinds of benefits would an emergency operations center bring?
Yeah, so I think one big thing that they noted, and Thigpen talked about, was that Klamath is really important for emergency response for what we call the big one.
Oh, no.
Which is the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. If you're not aware, you moved here recently, you might hear about the big one sometimes. It's this, there's a chance essentially that like an over 9.0 magnitude earthquake could happen just off the shore of Oregon and Washington in, like the next 50 to 300 years. We don't really actually know.
At some point.
It could literally happen in the next 10 minutes. It could happen in the next 300 years. Like, we don't know. But
quite the time frame.
Yeah, that's why we have to prepare for it, because it would be really disastrous. There'd be a huge tsunami, widespread destruction. There'd be a lot of damage to infrastructure, which would make recovery difficult, including damage to airports and things like that. So there'd be millions of people requiring emergency support like food and supplies and shelter. But Klamath Falls specifically is far enough away from the fault line that it shouldn't experience any major impacts, and that includes the airport there. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has designated Klamath Falls and Redmond, Oregon as the incident support bases for a Cascadia earthquake. So most of the emergency supplies that they need could be flown into these places before getting to where it needs to go in places like Eugene or Portland or Medford. And so right now, though, Klamath County doesn't have an emergency operations center to coordinate any of this. So, Thigpen said having an EOC in Klamath County should be a really really a high priority for the state in general. Plus, it would actually probably save the county money, which is a big part of it. These incident management teams would rent out this EOC and that bunkhouse, and then they could also use the EOC for local community events and rentals, or use it for county conference space when there's not an emergency going on. If he said if there's just 2 major wildfire teams, they could save around $54,000 a year. They're currently trying to fund the renovations through a grant from FEMA that they're going to hope to apply for next year. So we'll kind of see what goes on there and kind of get it up and running.
So it's not just important for Klamath County, but all of Oregon.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Roman. That's it for the debrief this week. Thanks for listening. You can reach the newsroom with comments on our coverage and suggestions for things we should cover in the future through our news tip line. That's on our website, ijpr.org. And you can find this program and more at jeffexchange.org, or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform.